How do I prepare a text for preaching? In preparing a sermon, I find it helpful to break up the job into two distinct parts, the front end and the back end. The front end of the sermon is all about communicating, application, that kind of stuff. The back end is preparing the text for communicating, making sure that I understand the text, making sure that I've summarised it and done my research in such a way that I'm set up to write a clear talk from the start, from the get-go. A really helpful tool, an invaluable tool that I use again and again in preaching is called the Preaching Pyramid, created by David Cook. I want to talk you through the Preaching Pyramid now. It's also in this section of the website as a resource that you can download and use yourself. So let's start with the bottom of the Preaching Pyramid, and you'll see there on the handout that it starts with a movements section. Here, we just want to notice the basic overarching structure of the passage. If it's a narrative, for instance, where are the scene changes, who's the main player in a particular scene. If it's an argument, what are the main points of the argument, how many points in the argument are there. That's the kind of stuff you put into the movements, just to give you a feel for the overarching structure of the passage we're looking at. Then we move on to the summary section. David Cook calls this the engine room of preaching preparation. And the reason why he calls it the engine room is because this is where we get really well acquainted with the text. We roll up our sleeve and we take notice of the details. In the summary section, you go through it in as much detail as you like, verse by verse, in your own words, writing down what the passage says. And this is really helpful because you begin to notice repeated phrases, you begin to notice parts of the passage you didn't understand on first reading, but you just sort of glossed over. Now you take notice of them, and so on and so forth. Once you've done the summary, we're ready to move on to the big idea. The big idea is getting to the pointy end of sermon preparation and the big question which creates the clarity. The big idea is what David Cook calls a pregnant sentence, which clearly summarises the meaning of the passage that you might hand on, for instance, to a friend who asked you what the gist of this passage was all about. That's what the big idea is. To get to the big idea, though, we first need to start with the subject. You'll see that in the pyramid. What is this passage talking about? Is it talking about evangelism? Is it talking about love? Is it talking about God's sovereignty? What's the subject? It might be 1, 2, or 3 words. Then after you've got the subject, we fill out the complement section of the pyramid. This is asking you in brief bullet points to outline what this passage says, again in summary, about the subject. What are the main points in the argument? Once you have the subject and the complement, you can put them together into this pregnant sentence, this sort of packed, clear, concise statement of what this passage is all about. And then once you have that, you can get to the big question. The big question is important in sermon preparation because it provides a spearhead for clarity. Once you have a big question, you can spend the sermon answering that question. It sort of organically creates this flow to the structure of your sermon. It's also really great to have a big question to present to the people you're speaking to, the listeners, straight up, so that they can see why this passage is so relevant and why we need to look at it together. So that's a brief summary of the Preaching Pyramid. I've also given you an extract from a book written by David Cook himself, which explains the pyramid, which you can have a look at. And I hope that you find it really helpful in doing the back-end work in your sermon preparation.